So yeah, I do want to talk about overstock in a bit. I want to ask you a couple questions though, sticking with
Sure.
rehypothecation for a minute. We got one question. What role do you think direct registration could play in affecting the amount of rehypothecation, if any? For example, like GameStop, something like a quarter of the float has been directly registered. Does that have an impact on brokers' ability to rehypothecate and chain lend, or is it doesn't matter because they can just take a small amount of shares and turn it into, this crazy chain?
Right. The short answer is I don't know. I will tell, if you mind, can I give a little bit of history about how we got here?
Sure.
So, and I know I mentioned last week the last time we talked, the paper crisis in the 1960s.
And I did want to ask about that. As a quick aside, did you see that Tennessee hearing about the Universal Commercial Code changes they were going to make?
Oh no, tell me about that.
Okay, all right. So let's go on a tangent for a second, because we did an episode of this last week where Tennessee made some changes to their laws around exceptions for bankruptcy priority. So what they have is, if you have a margin account or you've lent your securities out and the broker declares bankruptcy, the creditors have priority in a bankruptcy over you, the owner of those entitlements. And they changed that in Tennessee to say, no, the investor has priority in a bankruptcy over creditors. And David Webb, I think, was pushing for it, and he testified to start that hearing. And he talked about the paperwork crisis and the idea that, well, one, he said it was actually, maybe I saw this in a different one of his videos, but he said that it was actually the CIA, someone from the CIA, that founded the DTCC. And he had just barely been separated from the CIA. But he also made this point that that actually the paperwork crisis, where I had your slide up on this because it was so good, that the paperwork crisis from 1967 was something where they had to close the exchange every Wednesday for 6 months, I think. And then he said, but then it was over. Like, they actually got past it, but that didn't stop them from creating the DTCC, and then many years later using the paperwork crisis as justification for dematerialization, where it really wasn't a compelling reason. It was just something they could point to, but it was over at that point.
Yeah, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'll please send that to me. I'm a fan of David Webb, and he's having a moment right now.
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me. I think, well, let's talk about whatever the truth is about what the situation in the markets was. I do know this about Wall Street. Wall Street is a reactive set of institutions. So they are not innovative. They're not proactive. They are a reactive set of organizations. They benefit from very generous set of rules around them that raise barriers to entry. So they're almost never forced to be better about anything. They have to just be marginally better than the person across the street. But the set of somehow in the early 70s, whatever the case was with the paperwork crisis, it was agreed that the solution was immobilization and dematerialization. So those are the two words, those are the two key concepts that we live with today. We are the children, we're the grandchildren of immobilization and dematerialization. And they define every problem that we have in market plumbing today. Was these two, call it the original sin of the early 1970s. And when they created the Central Certificate Service in 68 and the Depository Trust Company in 73, the result of this is that all of this stock, the idea was, okay, we're going to take rather than moving the paper around in hand carts they would have these stock jobbers moving around in handcarts, and we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to just put all this paper in a building, and then somebody's going to have a registry of who the shareholders are, and then somebody else is going to be in charge of changing names in the registry, and that's going to be the transfer agent. Mm-hmm. So this is the birth of the registrars and the transfer agents. And we have that exact same system today. We have very sophisticated registrars and sophisticated transfer agents, maybe not so sophisticated in certain places. We have shorter settlement. It's T2 now. It's going to be T+1 in a few months.
Next month.
Next month.
Next month. No one's ready for it.
Everybody's ready. But we're still living in this dematerialized, immobilized world, which is almost all the problems. And so to David Webb's point, David Webb is very persuasively argues that you don't technically own any securities. You own a legal right. You have a share entitlement to somebody else's stuff held in somebody else's registry. And
this point, he actually, the case he brought up with Lehman, actually, I found fascinating. And I knew of this, but I hadn't really put it together. And he put it very succinctly. He said, because a lot of people would say, well, sure, fine. What's the problem with security entitlements? This is a great system. It's working so well, which, you go on to pick that argument apart, I think, very well. Right. But he was like, look at Lehman, where JP Morgan was both the custodian and the senior secured creditor.
Yes.
And so they just took the assets and your entitlements went poof.
Right. And that, just as a note there, years later, I was at a meeting with, not Lehman, I was at the meeting with Dick Fold, and he made that exact same argument. He said he knew what had happened, and he said that, and he was trying to argue for reform of the plumbing of the settlement system. He got it because he'd benefited from it for years, and he saw what happened to him when you're on the wrong side of the trade, and it's not pretty. Right. Just as a note, incidentally, you mentioned that the state case, and we don't have to talk about Overstock now, but I will say the Overstock case was interesting because it was a state case, and it was successful because it was in state court. And the attorneys who brought that case did so with a scalpel. They brought a scalpel, and they pled and they argued very carefully under California state security statute. And in a way, remember, you always want to avoid federal court. Federal court is where you take decades, nothing happens, and ultimately people will say supremacy clause, the SEC rules trump whatever the federal courts decide. So nothing ever happens. So the SEC writes rules poorly, they execute them poorly. Those become law in the federal courts, so you can never get justice.
Yeah.
So to find success, you have to go to state courts, and there's actually association, the National Association of State Securities
Administrators, yeah.
Yes, NASA. And back in the day, NASA were some of the first people arguing for market reform, having great conferences. There was a guy named Peter Shepkavage, who was a retired securities lawyer, who's a great advocate in these areas. Peter taught me a lot over the years, and he was a NASA administrator. And it was the states that had these statutes that were, because it used to be there were all these exchanges all over the country that had their own rules, so the states govern those exchanges.
And interestingly, this Tennessee law, the other change it made was to eliminate the ability for brokers to put a choice of law provision into their customer agreements. And so if you're a Tennessee investor, you have to be governed by Tennessee law.
Isn't that interesting? Well, the beauty of the federalist system is that ultimately power returns to the states, and that has to be. And it's the part of the efficiency of our process. And the state regulators, state lawmakers have to, if things aren't going to happen at the federal level, then the states have to be the ones that come in and make it happen. And so it's good to see that that's.
Yeah, I was watching the hearing, and I really wasn't. I didn't think it was a big deal, and then after David Webb got up there, someone from SIFMA came up, and he's like, "Everything is great. Don't you dare change anything." And I'm like, "All right, wait a sec. There's something here now. If they send someone to Tennessee, there's something here."
Right. That's funny. SIFMA came. SIFMA's always there.
Always.
They're always there outside the room.
Someone
getting
at
ready
the
to
SEC
comment.
told me that it's almost like they have a satellite office at the SEC. All right, here's another question we got.